Hi, I'm Mike Seymour. I'm the Visual Effects Supervisor and Second Unit Director on Red Dwarf, and welcome to this presentation of the visual effects that we did for Red Dwarf. Well, I got involved in this project, but in fact I was just a member of a large team. We had a huge number of people, like about 30 people working on the visual effects, and as you can imagine, we don't get out much, so we're kind of really glad to be able to put this on the DVD to show you some of the work we did. And we did do a lot of work. I think between the end of principal photography and delivery, we did about 262 shots in the month of March. So that was pretty much about 10 shots a day, every day of the week, 7 days a week, and we did tend to work about 7 days a week. One of the reasons we were able to do so many shots is that when I got involved, and I'd known Doug from before, we managed to expand effectively the budget of the visual effects by allowing members of my company, fxphd.com, to participate. So we actually had people working on this project around the world, from the Ukraine to China, from India to Chicago, from Manchester to Sydney. We also had a company here in Sydney that contributed a number of shots called Fin Design. So we managed to do a huge amount of work and distribute it around the world, and all of it so we could get the shows done, which we had a ball doing. So I'm going to show you some of those now. Our favourite one, or I guess, is what was called the London matte painting shot, which was a shot where we wanted to show putting stuff in London. And we actually, as we did with the mini shots, started working on this before we even shot, and we used things like Google Earth to work out a really good spot to stick the creator's sort of mansion. And we thought it'd be funny, or at least Doug did, to put it right beside the Houses of Parliament in London. And the idea is that we're going to shoot from the London Eye over to this side where we've got Big Ben, Westminster Parliament House, and over here is where we're going to be placing the pyramid behind me. This pyramid, of course, distinctive from Blade Runner. Now, to get that, we had to work out where we wanted to photograph and what the shot would be. To do that, we actually accessed Google and Google Maps and got the Street View kind of thing with the 3D models. That let us determine the shot angles. We also accessed Flickr and looked for anyone that had ever taken a photo of the obviously classic shot that you would from the London Eye. Now, there's actually a lot of people that have taken a lot of shots of this from Flickr, and that actually determined for us where on the circular path that the London Eye moves, where would be the optimum place to shoot. Now, the London Eye, if you don't know, never stops moving. It's constantly in rotation, even when you walk on and off the ride. So we had to time it out. We had to time out not only getting the tickets, of course, but once we got the tickets, time out the queue to the front of the queue, getting through security, where we wanted to be on the arc, get all that pre-approved with the director before we took the first shot, and we could time it out knowing that we wanted to be here when Big Ben lit up. We wanted it at magic hour. It would take us 45 minutes to get to the front of the queue and to get where we wanted to be around on the eye, so that when we jumped in the queue, everything was in motion. If we mucked it up, it was another 45 minutes, bare minimum, until we could get back to the same place. And by that stage, the light would have completely changed. We also shot on the first day with 2 or 3 backup days where we could come back if the weather was inclement. This stuff shot on the 5D is more than enough resolution. Of course, we shot it a little wider than we anticipated that we needed because, we have enough resolution to push in. Heaps of resolution, in fact, to do the 1920 by 1080 final deliverable that we would need. We worked out sort of geographically, we wanted to be about at 9 o'clock on the dial of the London Eye to take just the right photo, but we also wanted it at a particular time of day, because if you photograph it at any normal time of day, you get a kind of fairly bland photo. And we'd worked out the exact time of day when sunset, where the lights would come on Big Ben. Being obviously clever computer guys, we thought we had this down pat, and we had a great time doing it. But in fact, as we were on the London Eye taking these photos, we got to, effectively the top of the London Eye, and the lights still hadn't come on the Houses of Parliament. We got around to about 11 o'clock, and the lights still hadn't come on the Houses of Parliament. And I'm sort of thinking to myself, oh my God, if I muck this up, we're going to have to come back. And I'd obviously flown over to London, and John had flown in from Chicago. But as it turned out, as we hit 9 o'clock, as the maths had dictated, on came the lights, and we got this shot, which was the basis for the London matte painting. Of course, it's a great shot, and we had fun taking it, but it really is only just the start of the problem. We then had to put in everything that went in with that, which meant putting in a 3D model and everything else. But to make it really come to life, we devised the technique, or used the technique, where we modelled this section of London and then effectively got like a slide projector and projected our still image over the top of it. And once we had effectively a lit up piece of London sitting over some rough geometry and a lovely picture of our creator's building at the side, we could then start to move in and add moving people and moving buses and all the other things. And this shot was probably the longest shot we did. We probably started this before any other and was one of the last we had to finish. As it happened, actually, we did quite a lot of stuff with stills. There were whole sequences where I got to shoot just stills, like we did for some of the stuff with Chloe, and that went into the SFX magazine. And that was terrific fun doing that. But that's just an aside. These don't even count in our shot count of the 262 shots. These are all just, you know, some of the things that we also did. One of the shots that used stills enormously and primarily was always going to be what was called the Blade Runner scanning sequence. And this is where Crichton takes a look at the photo. In this case, it was going to be this photo, and zooms in on Rimmer's H. And then the script read that, you know, he zooms around and tracks left and tracks right and comes in and out and manages to find a reflection that gives away the location of the next place the guys had to go, which was Noseworld. And it sounded pretty simple, and when we read it, it seemed pretty fun. And yet, when we were on the first location at Coronation Street, we took this photo. And I actually have some footage of me taking this, and it's kind of funny because at this point, Richard hadn't joined the cast to play the guy at Noseworld, so we actually had to have a stand-in actor just stand there. We were going to replace him digitally later. And someone gets their photograph taken with you who's going to get digitally replaced, and we're going to go in on your H, so you need to be kind of more centrally positioned, and we need to actually, if you don't mind, you need to be so I can get rid of you, so you can't sort of touch anyone too much. So if you guys can, maybe he's behind you slightly, and you guys come forward a bit, and then that'll, no, you're definitely wanting to be in the shot. You just, yeah, more like that, exactly. It's just that later on we're going to erase you completely. So smiling, everyone's going to smile, and hold the pose. I know it's weird. Sorry about this. Brilliant, thanks for that. Yeah, so the idea is we do a scan in the scene we're in the cartoon, the comic book place, and then we'll get a reflection off the H, which gets to a puddle, which gets a reflection of that into a bathroom that bounces around the bathroom 3 times, and the whole time Robert's kind of like, and it's just ridiculous. Comes out, bounces off a bald guy's head, and sees something funny that Doug hasn't told me what it is yet. And by the end of the day, it's telling me something funny. So, as all good plans of mice and men goes, that was, of course, thrown away because we discovered then that we could get Richard. So then we came up with this photo, which was the actual photo of Richard. So now I thought, right, the team's right to go now. Now we can zoom in on this shot again, and we can do the flying around on the H. And the guys, especially people like Chris, were really good at me, you know, sticking cameras in their faces and doing this. Which all seemed like a great idea until we got a little further along and realized that it wasn't selling very well, that it wasn't playing very well to an audience. So then we thought, well, we can't get the guys back a third time to take this photo, so why don't we just go to the same spot and take a photo of a guy pretending to be a taxi driver, and we'll sort of comp them in together. So now we have our picture, and we added this guy at the side who was holding the business card, which would be the Noseworld business card, and would have the address and the phone number written on it. And we devised an elaborate sequence of bouncing around and coming in to find the other side of that. And as you know in the story, we find the business card and we get the address. As it happened, there were more hiccups. We had to get the type redone for various reasons, and we had this very elaborate sequence where we found a bathroom, and just like in the original Blade Runner, we bounced around the bathroom, off the knob of the bathroom, off the sink, which didn't use the mirror, out the window, and the whole thing seemed like a really great idea at the time. And then audiences found it vastly too confusing. So then we decided to simplify it. So we simplified the whole thing down. We finally got a sequence that we thought was working really, really well. At this point, however, we were now beyond the point where the guys had to use it as a prop in the show. When we got to post-production, we discovered that while we had this really great sequence, and while we had the guys picking up the prop photo that was the correct one with Richard in it, it didn't have our taxi driver at the side of frame. And this was a bit of a problem for us because they're meant to hold up a photo, and Crichton's meant to scan it, and we're meant to have this elaborate sequence, which we'd already redone about 6 times. And we discovered, to our horror, of course, that we now required the picture to be bigger. And so I started coming up with all these elaborate schemes that we were going to track and do computer pieces of paper that Craig was going to hold and do all this sort of stuff. And I must admit, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning and I was completely downtrodden and miserable. And I phoned up Doug and I said, look, we're going pretty well. So we've got two huge problems. The first is that the piece of, the photo they're holding basically doesn't have autographs, or rather has autographs on it because somebody signed it in the shop. So all the guys had signed it, and our one in the computer, which was done from pre-production, didn't. And the second problem was that it didn't have our taxi driver in. I couldn't see how we could do this without digitally replacing the piece of paper and everything. I worked out this was going to cost us about 40 hours of computer graphics, and it involved a 3-man team for about, a week or two. And Doug was like, what's the problem? And I said, well, don't you see that they're holding this thing and it needs to be bigger and the thing is smaller, and how can we get from smaller to bigger, and it's going to be all this work. But anyway, we're happy to do it. Here I am, 3 o'clock in the morning, completely downtrodden, and Doug over the end of the phone just says, oh, I can fix that. I'll just put a line in that says uncrop. This is why we love Doug Naylor. So there he goes. In the show, as it happens, you'll see it comes up on the screen, and as Doug had predicted or said he would do, one of the guys delivers the line uncrop. All problems solved. It's funny because we're making a comedy and we're away. So obviously working in this environment, it's just terrific having that kind of interaction with stuff going on. But of course, on a more serious note, some of the stuff we were doing was the big virtual sets. In other words, getting what was essentially a fairly confined area on a soundstage to look like a massive, massive Red Dwarf ship. And I'd always thought this was one of the most interesting things about Red Dwarf, that the ship itself I'd calculated was so big that it was just in depth higher than the Empire State Building, and that in length it was either halfway or twice as long as Sydney Harbour. And so I really wanted to show that epic scale, and we knew that we couldn't do it unless we shot green screen. We had to put a bunch of virtual sets in. Some of the ones that I guess were more obvious were the corridor or hall sequences, where we worked our way through various designs to come up with a look that would be the hallway that especially Katarina and Rimmer would walk down. But one that I guess we're most proud of is the huge G-deck set itself. This is the initial drawing that I did as just something to kind of get some conversation going. It's an appallingly bad drawing, but it was good enough that we could get Mike James to have a look at it at Fin Design, who came up with this more elaborate version of what I'd done. And we kind of liked this and we thought that was pretty good. So we started exploring it with Fin Design to get a large, detailed set. And so we obviously built it to try and look like it had scale. The trouble is, even though the computer says that this is 5 kilometers long, it doesn't necessarily look like it's 5 kilometers long. So we have to start adding tons and tons of detail into it to make it starting to look good. But we got to this point here, and this was the first point that I think we showed it to certainly the guys on set, and we had this on set as lighting reference. And we felt now that we'd started to get somewhere that looked kind of fairly big, but we knew we needed to put a lot of stuff down the end of G-deck. But it wasn't just enough that we had this kind of one frame of G-deck. We'd have lots and lots of angles on the green screen that we'd have to fill out and put in. And so for every single shot, we'd have to track and work out exactly where the camera was. This is a top view looking down, exactly where they were in relationship. And then we'd, in the offline process, or when we finished doing principal photography, we'd take the live action and kind of stick it over rough 3D and see if they kind of lined up, and keep massaging the 3D and the live action until we finally got something that we thought looked pretty good. And then of course we'd render it out. And if you're really perceptive, you might have a look down G-deck, and I'd be interested to know if any of you can pick any of the funky stuff way down the end. But if you're really clever, you'll notice that because we just had to have stuff down there to give it scale, we just needed to use models and things we had lying around. And there's actually the upturned end of the Red Dwarf engines sitting way down the end of G-deck. Now, they're not meant to be the engines, of course. They're meant to be some turbo something, something, something. But Doug was quite happy for us to have just anything that looked kind of techie and industrial and epic to go down the end there. So now we've got G-deck, which looks great, and we've got our actors to go in G-deck, but there's still a couple of missing components. One of them is the really cool, really interesting dimension cutter effect that comes up. And the dimension cutter effect is something that has to build up and form, and we had to come up with a whole new look for that because we wanted it not to look like anything we'd seen before. And this is one of those tests that Kenneth did for us, who is in Northern Europe, and he came up with this terrific look using some computer software that was done for sort of art and simulation work, and wasn't designed for visual effects, but we thought it started to produce a really nice look. So between work that was being done in in Europe and the work that was being done here in Sydney with the diving bells and stuff, we started to build up the components that we needed. So we now had the green screen components of people like Sophie, who did a great job acting out her roles, and we started placing her and the guys in the environment and then adding these extra elements in, like the dimension cutter, to kind of build stuff up. And that seemed to be working out pretty well. We had some really good detailed sets, and in this particular picture you can really see what I'm talking about that Red Dwarf engine looking a bit prominent there. I think we pushed it further down as we went along. And then we started working out how to mix in the dimension cutter effect, how that would sit in, and whether it would have like a white light or it'd be a black hole, or what it would look like, and finally built up to some of the final images that we had, which was great and really terrific. We now had the dimension cutter, we had GDEC, we had cool things flying around and stuff. The only thing we didn't have flying around, however, was the actual principal cast, the boys of Dwarf, because while we'd done some wire work, we didn't really have, we felt like the kind of signature shot of them being sucked into the vortex. And quite frankly, it's a pretty complicated wire rig to do. And I offer this now partly as an explanation and partly as an apology to my good friends Danny and Craig and Chris and Robert, because we get them to do some pretty wacky things at times. And this is one of the things that we asked them to do. We asked them to stand in a fairly neutral pose, each of them. And I think by this stage we'd already got Rimmer to fly through the hole, so we only had 3 of the guys to do it, and sort of rotate on the spot, which quite frankly is one of the reasons why I have immense, I just owe these guys a debt of gratitude, because no matter how ridiculous a thing we asked them to do, they just jumped in and happily did it without question. But once we'd done that, we actually could rebuild digital versions of the guys in the computer. And here you can see we have our first tests of getting Crikey to be sucked up and lifted off. And these, of course, are all just computer simulation models to allow us to have digital versions of the actors. And once we felt that we'd got that, we could start putting them in locations and doing things that they otherwise, of course, couldn't do. So here, for example, they're hanging on a pole, which looks a bit lame at this stage. But once we get into the sequence a bit more, you can see that we can have the guys lifting up and taking off and really have some fun with it and playing with it. So that was it, basically, that and just a ton of other stuff. We did some cool sort of old school techniques. We did some fun, simple techniques. We had to have Rimmer pushing a vase and catching it in the air, and we did that just old school with rods, which we removed in post-production. A couple of neat tricks. If you're going to do a job like that, like a trick where you have a visual effect, the trick is to always do the visual effect before the point that the audience has worked out the visual effect is happening. So in this particular case, the vase was never on the table. We put a digital vase in flying up to what was then on the rod, and then of course that allows Rimmer to walk over and actually grab the real vase, hold it, and toss it over to the cat or to Danny. And they've got, of course, something real to work with. And by the time you've seen it frozen in the air and you start studying it, all our visual effects work is done. But there was a whole lot of those, from origami, which was all done with digital manipulation, to a ton of bits and pieces throughout the entire project. All in all, as I say, there was probably 30 people working on it, and an immense effort, just tons and tons of stuff that you sort of look at and you guess you don't really take for granted. But in this shot here, for example, with the monitors on the TV set, every one of these monitors had to have not only an image placed in the monitor electronically, and that had to track with its monitor, but each one had to be individually color graded so it looked a bit different, and the contents of what went in the monitors had to be created. And in fact, this design sequence was done by my partner John Montgomery. A lot of this compositing was done by my other business partner Jeff Huser and another chap, Rowan, in India. And they were basically sticking stuff in monitors for weeks, and all tireless work. But hey, we delivered on time and on budget, and Doug seemed happy and the guys seemed happy, and hopefully you guys thought it was not a bit crap. So thank you so much for this walk through the visual effects of Red Dwarf. I appreciate it. See ya.